And now for something completely different. So today we're going to talk about some things off the wall. I'm going to relate it all back to why I believe we should garden the way that I garden and the way that many others garden. And I'm going to use some examples on it. We're going to talk about a tale of two cities, and we're going to talk about the Fermi Paradox, as strange as that may sound. And we're going to interlink them all back and bring it all back around. So grab a cup of joe, sit down, and enjoy a little bit of story time. So it's story time. We're going to do a tale of two cities. So what I want you to think about right now is there's two oil patches that have been discovered, and two different companies are going to go set up brand new cities on these landscapes. The two oil patches aren't interconnected whatsoever. The first company goes in and it sets up 10 oil rigs, a couple refineries, the oil drills, 10 oil drills, and they're going to harvest that oil as fast as possible, grab the profits, and move on. They're going to set up a city infrastructure, all the housing and shops and everything that they need to support all their employees and the transportation of that oil. And they're going to withdraw it from the land as quick as possible, grab their profit, and go. On the other side of the tracks, in the other unconnected oil reserve that is just as big as the other one, as the first one, a company goes in with a bit of a longer term perspective of this. They're going to install two oil rigs and one refinery and all the infrastructure they need to do it. They're going to then, as they pull the oil out of the system, they're going to reinvest, but they're not going to reinvest in oil. They're actually going to reinvest in infrastructure to build a city that's sustainable in that area long term. So they're going to put up a bunch of wind turbines on hills. They're going to put solar panels on all the houses. Eventually, when they get enough profit, maybe they even put in a nuclear plant. But they're going to put in infrastructure in order to support the town long term. So now we're going to check in on those towns 1 or 2 years after they set up their infrastructure in their cities. What we'll find is the town with 10 oil rigs have extracted 5 times as much oil out of their ground as the town that only set up 2. Additionally, the town that set up 10 got so filthy rich that all the employees are living in big houses. They're buying expensive cars, expensive food, expensive clothes. The town on the other side of the tracks, however, they've only pulled out 1/5 of what the other town had pulled out. And they're also spending all their money on building infrastructure. They're building solar panels, and they're building, all the water systems and everything to keep the town long term. The first town's just looking to extract all the oil and move on to the next project, but the town across the road is looking long term. Fast forward 10 years later, now we're actually going to start looking at how the towns look in relation to each other. The town that was drilling 5 times as fast is starting to realize the pressure on their extraction drills and pumps is actually starting to fall off. They're planning for the future and they're planning ahead, so they're actually going to start laying some staff off. They're going to start pulling some of the people out. As they do, different industries around the town are going to start struggling a little bit. The grocer that used to have access to the full town's worth of people is now having to downsize and consider their own rescale back into a sustainable way that they can continue operation. On the other side of the tracks, however, the first town, they're just still humming away. It's been a while later, but they're possibly at the same amount of reserve left that the first town had after only a year or two of operation. 10 years now down the road, the first town is scrambling and trying to figure out where they're going to move to next after they've depleted all the natural oil in the ground. The first town, however, they're continuing to expand their infrastructure. They're using all the profits and all the money that they're getting from the oil to develop science and technology and how to make the rest of it last even longer. And they're finding ways to live sustainably and build community such that other endeavors that they maybe didn't even think about when they first started the town are now starting to develop. Maybe monorails are popping up. They have a maglev train going back and forth between the refinery and the oil wells, and their distribution centers, and they're starting to do things more efficiently because they slowed down the amount of burst wealth that they could get. And because of that, just like a toddler when he gets $50 from Christmas and has to spend it right away, and he just looks for something to buy, because they were never in that situation, they were growing a little bit slower and a little bit more sustainably. By definition, just as a consequence of living like that, they had longer term pictures and goals, and they found ways to live in a lower energy lifestyle. But then also, now in the future, they're developing longer term technology because they've been spending more of that profit in smart ways to advance their town. So let's pause the story there, and we're actually going to talk about the Fermi Paradox. I'm going to put a bit of a twist on the story now. We'll let that old story sit and you can soak that in. I think you kind of understand where I'm going with it. But now I want to twist it up a little bit and introduce some questions that might hopefully get you thinking about where we're going. So for anyone who doesn't know what the Fermi Paradox is, or have never heard of it, it's the idea that it looks at the scale of the size of the universe. The universe is absolutely massive, with multiple galaxies. Now, the local group galaxy are all the galaxies that we can kind of ever have a hope of observing based on the speed of light and the speed that the galaxies are separating away from us from the Big Bang. So just looking at the Milky Way galaxy, which is the galaxy that the Earth is in, there's an estimated 400 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, and roughly 20 billion stars similar to our star, Sol. We believe that there's around 0.1% of those stars have Earth-like planets. That leaves billions of planets still remaining that are Earth-like planets in our solar system alone. If those Earth-like planets are within the Goldilocks zone, which is where water can be liquid, and even if 1 in 1,000 of those is in that Goldilocks zone, there's still an incredible amount of places where life can potentially have originated on. Now combine that with the fact that the planet Earth is actually fairly old, fairly young. The universe, our galaxy is fairly old compared to how old our planet is. So the Earth-like planets that are out there would have had a massive head start on us in terms of developing life. So if there's so many Earth-like planets in our galaxy alone, and they all had a head start over us, then where's all the life? And this is where the Fermi Paradox comes in. And it estimates, and it poses a question, is maybe a better way to put it, that what if life hasn't reached us and we can't observe life because there are several great filters out there that stops life from proceeding to the point where it can colonize worlds outside of its own world. Some of those might be just the sheer amount of energy required in order to get interstellar. And there's this thing called the Kardashev scale, where it talks about type 1, type 2, type 3 civilizations. A type 1 civilization is a civilization who can harness all the energy of their home planet. A type 2 would be a civilization that can harness all the power of its own solar system. And then a type 3 would be a civilization that's basically living and has spread all throughout its own galaxy. Now it seems like even just for us getting to the nearest star or the nearest planet and colonizing anything, that seems like a really big deal. But in galactic terms, once we basically make that leap in order to be able to colonize any other planet out there or a planet on another star by making a generational, 1,000-year spaceship, once we make that leap, fairly quickly after that, in terms of galactic level, would we be able to colonize the entire galaxy? So if we're not seeing any evidence of that, and no other alien race or intelligent being has done that yet, because we would likely have observed it by now, then this introduces the ideas of there's great filters out there that can stop us, and that's that's equal parts exciting and terrifying at the same time. So the first possibility is that there just simply aren't any great filters. Now, if there aren't any great filters, then we would question probably why we haven't seen any intelligent life out there. And this kind of leads us into this Fermi paradox. The other potential is that there are great filters. And the last two options come based on where those great filters are. We know that the dinosaurs existed and dominated this planet for longer than we have, much, much longer than we have. The dinosaurs got erased by a large comet asteroid impact on the planet, which kind of reset most of the life on the planet. There's other potential great filters as well, such as a biological virus or disease that wipes out the majority of a civilization. So, and then there's many other potential options, whether it's technology, an interstellar race that is so far advanced that as soon as another race gets detected that is intelligent enough to challenge it, it just comes in and just wipes it out and harvests all the resources from the planet. So when I'm talking about a filter, I'm talking about a reason why a species or a race will not be able to travel to another planet or solar system and colonize the rest of its own galaxy. The first leap takes a long time to get to in order to get to that level of technology so that you can actually leave your planet. The energy involved to actually leave and exit the gravitational force of your planet and then travel a distance that's very large in a time frame enough that that you can actually colonize the new planet, and then repeat that in a spiraling cascade, and relatively quick after that colonize the entire galaxy that you're in. For us, it'd be the Milky Way galaxy. So these filters are things that prevent that and erase a species before they actually get to that level, because had another species get to that level, we would probably see evidence of them, whether it's chemical signatures on planets and stars that we look at, whether it's ruins of ancient species, whether it's just them actually releasing radio frequencies such we have with Explorer and all this sort of stuff. So we haven't seen any of that yet. So the last two potentials for the Great Filter are, there are great filters out there. The dinosaurs experienced one of them. And we have been lucky enough to not experience one as bad as that, or else we would also be erased. So the potential is that there is a great filter out there, potentially multiple great filters, and we just haven't hit them yet, or we have passed them already and we are beyond them, and that's really good news. So if there are great filters and we've already passed them, this could be something as simple as it takes a drastic leap forward in order to go from single cell organisms to multi-cell organisms. It could be that it takes a drastic leap forward in order to go from a dead, non-organic planet and then have something happen, lightning storms, volcanoes, life brought from other asteroids, whatever the trigger point is to create organic compounds, single cellular organisms, that is so rare that it just simply hasn't happened yet statistically in the rest of the universe. The other potential is that there are great filters out there and we just haven't hit them yet. So now we're going to go back to our town example. And as this first town is starting to lose its oil reserves, and it hasn't set up any kind of contingency or background, and it hasn't developed any infrastructure, they're running out of time and they're running out of energy. And they've sent scientists all around the world to find more oil so that they can do it again and go to the next spot, but they haven't found any yet. they're in an existential crisis level mode right now. And everything that they need to do in order to get past this is long gone. They need to build infrastructure, but they don't have the energy reserves left to do it because they've squandered it all. They're in real big trouble. The other company, or the other town, the second town on the other side of the tracks, they've spent all of their energy reserves that were in the town on developing infrastructure, developing technology, and getting their town ready, for the harsh winter that's going to come, and the harsh realities that they're facing by having a finite amount of resources on a planet. They haven't been building and growing exponentially. They've just been building and growing within the means. Now, the funny thing is, both towns had the same amount of net energy. In fact, actually what we'll find is the town that harvests its resources slower will actually have more energy to do and to move on to the next stage of how on earth they're going to survive on a planet with no oil than the first town, who just pulled it all out of the ground as fast as possible. Now we're going to fast forward a little further into the future. The first town that mined all its resources and grew exponentially and kind of frivolously wasted their energy, they don't have the infrastructure that they need in order to survive. And worse, they actually grew so fast and they outscaled themselves so much that they're actually going to need more energy to deal with the more larger economic capacity that they developed in that time. Their crash is going to be much more severe than the other side. They're actually facing a Fermi Paradox Great Filter, and they didn't even really know it yet. And the Great Filter was that there's only so much of this non-renewable resource on at their access level, and they need to use it wisely. Now, using it is actually not a bad thing, but they need to use it wisely, and Town A didn't. Town B, on the other hand, they've been extracting the oil out slower. Now, the funny thing is that they actually had the same amount of oil reserves as the previous town. However, because they used it and spent it in order to develop infrastructure, they were able to extend how long until they reach their Great Filter. They're facing the exact same Great Filter, only so much energy native and stored inside the planet that they can access. All other energies that they're going to need in order to get past their Great Filter, they need to find ways to get sustainable long-term sources of energy. However, because they extracted less energy per unit time, and because they reinvested that energy into developing infrastructure and technology, they're actually going to be able to use that same amount of energy plus have a longer duration where they're using their green energy. And this longer duration of using their green energy is actually going to put their net total energy consumption available in order to pass their Great Filter much higher. Additionally, the consequence of when they start running out of their surplus, out of their base load native supply of energy, is going to be a much lower consequence, because they didn't grow so fast and outscale themselves. So they actually are growing more sustainably. Because they're growing more sustainably and slower, they have longer. Because they have longer, they're collecting more sunlight, they're collecting more water flow, they're collecting more wind, more passive sources of energy. So they're reducing the consequence of them hitting the wall, and they're giving themselves more time to develop the technology, and they're all doing it with the exact same amount of energy that Town A did. So now let's go back to the Fermi Paradox and what my personal opinion is of what a potential Fermi Paradox can be for civilizations and races in the reality that we know it. It's very potential. There's a possibility that one of the Fermi paradoxes is that each planet that can sustain life has two distinct phases. The first phase is a base load of development of life, such that the death of that life will seed energy into the planet in the form of oil and hydrocarbons, that the actual true potential species can extract down the road. Now, that species that's eventually going to potentially have the ability to get off their planet, they may be the same species that develops this whole time with this native load of energy. However, they would very much have to function as Town B, where they are living very sustainably and with a low energy lifestyle, such that they don't outstrip and outpace their ability to pull that hydrocarbon out of the planet, so that they have time to develop the technology they need. And they also increase the duration where they're at a high technology level, pulling in renewable sources of energy, so that they can actually develop a larger base load of energy. That second part I want to talk about. When Town A just went in and strip mined the oil out of the ground for maximum profits, they had two problems when they did that. The first is that they got all of their energy gone right away. They couldn't invest in the infrastructure that they need in order to harvest more energy, and I'll talk about that in a second. The second problem is that they had a timing issue. They had their energy surplus when they were relatively primitive. They had all their oil and all their hydrocarbons that they were burning, and the technology that's required to burn, to extract, and then burn off the hydrocarbons is relatively primal. You really just need to be able to drill a hole in the ground, and then you need to have developed fire. You need to find the stuff, and then you need to burn the stuff. And then you need to find ways to deal with the heat, whether that's just actually using the heat or whether it's to drive industry. However, the problem is that this energy surplus came in a really poor time for them. They used and spent all their energy on low tech, low advancement state of technology that cannot get them off the planet. They cannot get them in order to develop the renewable energies and technology that's required to sustain and live a town long term. Town B, on the other hand, that spent their energy more slowly and developed the infrastructure, what they actually did was they took that chunk of oil that was left over when Town A ran out of oil. They took whatever they had remaining and they moved it over to the time period where they were the most advanced possible. So all that energy from the hydrocarbons was going to get spent, and it's going to get spent now in the time frame where they can actually develop real, much more advanced technology. And additionally, because they extended the duration of when that happens, not only would it be longer at the end of Town A's perspective, but because Town B lasts longer, they're going to have that energy even further down the road. The final thing is Town B, because they lasted longer and because they extended out the period that they were harvesting renewable energies, and because they moved that oil patch of energy down to the end where they developed higher technologies to apply that energy to, they were able to increase the ceiling of how much energy total over the course of their town's history that they were able to gain access to. Now, some of these things that we're going to have to find ways to deal with, they could be very exothermic in nature, or they could be very endothermic in nature. There could be a huge energy barrier in order to get people up out to the next planet, the next star, to find the next set of resources that we need in order to continue harvesting. Just simply delivering materials from one place to another in order to establish conditions that we can start terraforming and developing new planets. That's a tremendous energy expenditure, and we need that tremendous energy to be available to us when we need it. We don't need it now. We don't need a ton of energy when we're cavemen with sharp spears. We need it. We need all that energy so that we can develop renewables to make us last longer, so that we have energy available to get materials and build structures outside of our planets. The last thing I want to talk about is the fact that both towns will have, by the time they go and they hit the Great Filter, and they either make it or they don't, it's very likely that there will be the only shot, the only chance for this civilization on this planet in order to get out and off this planet and continue their journey. Ideally in a sustainable way, so that they're taking sustainable practices to the next planets. However, there's only so much organic matter that's deposited in, and the time scale is so long that there's a very real potential that even if the town fails and the world reverts back into a primal state and starts building up that organic matter and getting oil back into the ground, that process is so slow and so long that there's a very real potential that we hit a final candle wick timer that acts on all of us, which is essentially the life of stars, the amount of energy total before all the yellow, white, red, brown stars run out of their fuel, and space goes dark, completely dark. That's an absolute limit on how long we have to figure this out. So why am I talking about all this? Well, one, because I actually was thinking about this kind of stuff this morning, and I really wanted to put a video together to explain the importance of sustainable living. Often I'll put posts up on Reddit or I'll discuss on discussion boards about this, and I find this isn't on people's radar enough. And this is an existential threat to the human race. We're facing actually multiple existential threats that are all linked to a constant growth economy. Whether it's deforesting the planet for resources, global warming by putting carbons in the air, and just running out of oil and energy reserves like peak oil. Whether it's acidifying the oceans, causing a phytoplankton collapse, which is where the majority of our oxygen comes from. Actually not from trees, but deforesting the trees and collapsing the phytoplankton is devastating. Whether it's bare soil monoculture style agricultural farming, industrial agriculture farming that leaves soil bare so that soil microbiology dies from the sun's UV, the soil goes hydrophobic, water does not leach down into the soil and instead stays on top and then runs on contour, washing soil into our lakes and rivers and oceans, to the point where Stanford University estimated we had 60 years of topsoil remaining, and this was 5 years ago. We're experiencing multiple terrifying existential threats. We need to sort this out immediately, like right away. Global warming scientists issued a statement, "Wake up, stupid, do something stupid." We need to wake up and we need to solve this stuff, like right now. So all that being said, I'm really not anti-oil or gas. I'm just anti-consumerism. I think that oil and gas is a stepping stone that a species needs to use the native energy reserve on its planet in order to get it to the next level. But it needs to spend that in developing infrastructure so that the ground floor rises. And then it needs to control its consumerism, its rampant consumerism, a scale of growth of the economy, so that the ceiling is lowered, so that when you're forced into that lower energy lifestyle, the crash is less. For example, 2008's economic pullback, the Federal Reserve bailed out all the banks that put us in this situation in the first place. The economy as it is, just it can't function. We can't have constant growth in a finite planet. We shouldn't be bailing out and propping up the old system that's destroying us. The amount of money that we spent on bailing the banks out, if we would have been able to put solar panels on every single house in America. tell me which of those futures you would rather have today, where largely all the money that went into the banks is gone now. It was spent to buy temporary stability. However, had it been spent on infrastructure, we would have, I'm Canadian, but the United States would have had incredibly more stability on having solar panels up on every single house. It's this move away from consumerism and towards building stability long term that we really need to focus on. So that was a little sobering, but for good reason. I want to kind of get you guys thinking, who do you think we are? Are we Town A or Town B? My personal opinion is, we're clearly not Town B, although I wish we were. I think we're Town A, that's maybe 20 years down the road and has been operating in this maximum potential extraction mining mindset and wasting all that precious Fermi Paradox Filter critical resource in order to get us to the next level of technology. I think a lot of the oil that we've pulled out of the ground in our history has really gone towards creating this consumerism, capitalistic society where the views and the focus is so short term. We'll replace furniture, clothing that's very functional still. We'll go out and throw that in the garbage because it's just slightly out of date. It's not fashionable anymore. And then we'll go and we'll burn all this fossil fuel in the manufacturing and shipping of all these new products just to get something that basically is functionally identical. It just is maybe more in fashion, or it's just slightly nicer. There's no tiny little nick on the table. The furniture doesn't have a tiny little rip or patch in it. And it's really this stuff that we have to really try to resist. Just the consumerism around Christmas is crazy. And even just in one generation, maybe it could just be the family I grew up in and the family that we're in now. But it's really changed in just one generation. Kids' birthday parties. It used to be okay to have a kid's birthday party in your backyard and just play hide and seek and manhunt. And now it's expected that you go and spend several $100s renting bouncy castles and, just spend, and it's almost a status symbol. All this stuff that we're doing, it's got carbon footprint associated with it. I think that we really need to be a little bit more cognizant of how we're spending that precious resource. A lot of the stuff that we're doing, it's potentially Fermi Paradox Great Filter level stuff, and it's all spurred and driven by this constant growth economy where you can have a very successful company that's making billions of dollars, but if it doesn't grow by another 5%, then year to year, then it doesn't beat inflation, and it's a total dud of a company. And it's just we can't keep growing exponentially and even at a constant rate on a finite planet. It's fundamentally impossible. I want to shout out to Rob Avis, Verge Permaculture. He had Richard Heinberg on as an interview. This is a book called The End of Growth by Richard Heinberg. If you haven't checked this out, it's a really, really good book. It has a lot of collaborators on it, from managing director of JP Morgan to university professors. the amount of very, 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 very well respected, smart, intelligent people who have devoted their entire career into this sort of economic and environment stuff that went into writing this book. It's a very high quality book. It's not just one rambling guy who's a tree hugger hippie. It's a lot of diverse opinions from diverse sectors about how we need to change the path that we're on. So I highly recommend it. It's The End of Growth by Richard Heinberg. Check it out. So we're getting ready to go to hockey again. The thing I want to leave you with is that I want you to pass on to your kids, like I'm passing on to my kids, about how the world that they grow up in is going to be fundamentally different than the one that we grow up in. We're already to the point where we're putting 11 barrels of oil in to get 10 barrels of oil out of the ground. And we need to find a way that we're going to build infrastructure and develop infrastructure so that we can extend the amount of energy that we can harvest out of the planet and do it in a sustainable way. We have to have all of these little kids growing up in a planet and focusing on living sustainably in harmony with nature and lifestyles that are in balance and that are possible long term. And we have to focus on developing and solving the problems that we've created, that my parents and grandparents and my generation has created. Unfortunately, we're just passing the buck down the road, and it's little guys like these two that are going to have to solve a lot of those problems. It would be really nice if we did a lot of the upfront work to help them out. So how that impacts you and your gardening, I think everything that I said about how the economy works and how Town A versus Town B operated. Town A was very much a mining operation that extracted maximum amount of nutrient or energy out of its system and then moved on. That's the way that industrial agriculture works currently. We mine the soil for nutrient, and then the farm dies and goes dry, loses its topsoil, loses its organic matter, and then they move on and they stick up a subdivision in its place, and we just constantly creep out. When you're designing your own gardens, you're going to be doing the same thing. If you are focused on destroying the systems that you require in order to do your gardening, then you're going to have to replace those functions of everything that you just destroyed. So all my videos talk about this, and how when you're setting up a garden system, you should be setting up with a long-term vision. Even if the next year the garden might be equal production or maybe even slower, as long as year after year the sustainable system is putting in ecosystems and building symbiotic relationships that are looping on each other and building strength and resiliency and nutrient cycling, feedback cycles, water cycling, water storage, capturing the most amount of the free energy sources, the the water and the sun, by overplanting and designing in 3D, capturing the most amount of sunlight, chopping some sacrificial species onto the ground with the sole purpose of building organic matter in the soil, so that the life cycle now becomes a building, snowballing system that's going to propel your gardens further into the future. It takes time. These systems, they're slow by nature. They take time in order to develop, and you have to have faith and confidence to do it and to stick with it. And if you want to keep your old garden where you tilled and you left bare soil, and then run a sustainable ecosystem garden like I'm doing and compare, just make sure you don't give up after year 1, because it's after year 2, 3, 4 that you're going to really see the leaps and bounds, because you're going to be capturing more energy and you're going to be developing more of a sustainable machine that then you don't need to keep up with constant human inputs. Nature doesn't need us. If we disappear, everything turns back into a sustainable, even regenerative forest. So it's that regenerative forest that we need to mimic. It's that regenerative forest that's going to sequester carbon, and that's how you're going to get ahead. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Talk to you later.